Hello and welcome back to the People Power Lunch Hour show. I'm your host, Vanessa Maria Graber. On today's show, we are celebrating Black History Month, not just today, but all month long. And we are featuring stories about famous Philadelphians and Philadelphians who have made a huge impact on history. On today's show, we are going to be talking about the life and work of Octavius Catto. If you don't know him, he was a scholar, organizer, soldier, athlete, and Philadelphia hero. He was a tireless advocate for his people and believed that education and civic engagement was a means to better his people. He was most well known for leading the Institute for Colored Youth, assembling some of the first Black Army regiments to fight in the Civil War, working to pass the Bill of Rights for public transportation, being an accomplished Black baseball athlete, and organizing African American men to be able to vote and get out and vote. And he did all of this before the age of 32. On today's show, we'll talk with historian V. Chapman-Smith about Catto's legacy. V. Chapman-Smith has been serving as the Catto Memorial Vice President for Education Initiatives and recently was the project manager for the first Catto Education Initiative supporting the memorial. This initiative provided professional development to 90 Philadelphia educators, building their competencies and engaging students in issues of race relations. The initiative reached over 11,000 public school students. Through this project, Chapman-Smith spearheaded the creation of the Catto Education Portal, OV Catto and American Civil Rights on the website ushistory.org. She also advised artists Willis Nomo Humphrey and Keir Johnston on the creation of the Catto Mural Arts mural at University Charter School on the 1400 block of Catherine Street here in Philadelphia. Chapman-Smith retired from the United States National Archives in 2018, bringing to end over 40 years of leadership experience focused on organizational capacity building with an emphasis on using cultural assets and history to improve urban education and civic life. Over her career, Chapman-Smith has been recognized for promoting civic understanding in a diverse society and has made a lifelong commitment to improving outcomes for children and their families. She has served and continues to serve on a number of civic policy groups, commissions, and boards, and place particular emphasis on education and public use of historical assets to improve understanding. She's going to talk with us and share all of her amazing knowledge about Octavius Catto. Thank you so much for being here. Welcome to the show.
Well, thank you for Vanessa for inviting me today. I'm actually excited about being here.
Yes, Octavius Catto is really an amazing story. The fact that he accomplished so much at 32, the fact that he accomplished so much at 32 years old is pretty amazing. One of the things that I wanted to talk about, again, is his life as a scholar, right? He was a pretty brilliant young man. He had a lot of opportunities to go and teach elsewhere, but he was committed to staying and mentoring the students at the Institute for Colored Youth, which was a Quaker school.
Yeah, it was managed by Quakers, but the school itself focused largely on the African American community here in Philadelphia. And Catto himself was a student at the school, and it was through the school that he was able to really expand his knowledge and ability and to become one of the sort of highlights or shining stars of the African American community. He showed a great propensity for education, and that was one of the reasons that his father, William Catto, was willing to make the necessary sacrifices to have him go to the Institute of Colored Youth. It was not an easy school to attend, although by the time Catto got there, it was a free school. However, when you didn't have your kids working for supporting the family, because back then most families needed everybody pitching in, could be a hardship. But he felt it was important that his son go to this school because he could see the brilliance in him. He took very well to the classical education that the school offered. to us today, it's hard to think of going to a school with a classical education because it means you've got to, at a very young age, you have to be interested in Greek and Roman culture and language. And Catto became very proficient with Greek and Latin. You also have to do advanced mathematics, and be proficient in English oratory, which many of us can't do today. Most of us are fearful of standing up and doing public speaking. But he showed a great ability in that. And he was one of the leading, if not the leading student in his school during his time attending there. After finishing the school, he still didn't feel that he had enough competency in Greek and Latin. So he went to Washington, D.C. and worked with a private tutor to help build his skill even more. And so that experience as well gave him a great foundation for becoming an extraordinary teacher at the Institute for Colored Youth, which, by the way, was a high school, a preparatory school. At the time Catto was attending the Institute for Colored Youth, there were opportunities opening up for African Americans to go to college. Catto himself did not go to college. He just had the Institute for Colored Youth. But it gave him this amazing foundation. And when he was out, not only in the black community, but in the white community, he would demonstrate these proficiencies he developed. And there was great respect for him in many quarters in Philadelphia. So he truly was a great scholar. And, you know, one of the reasons his father sent him to the Institute for Colored Youth, too, was because it was a school that was focused on developing teachers. So that meant his son could become a teacher. And that was a great career to have. I don't know, we don't seem to look at teachers in the same way today, but, you know, the people in the community often refer to him as professor. I don't think any of us really call our high school teachers professor. And, you know, he was much admired for his ability, and his students seem to have loved him in many quarters.
Yeah, and he was offered the opportunity to go to New York or D.C. with very prestigious institutions, and he chose to stay in Philadelphia.
Well, I think he was grounded in Philadelphia. I mean, he came to Philadelphia as a young man. He had family connections here in Philadelphia. We don't always speak about those, but some of his family members were through his mother's line, and so he had cousins and other connections. But he also built a strong network of friends. And sometimes when you get comfortable in a place, it's hard to leave. In addition to that, Philadelphia was truly an important place during Catto's lifetime. It was the largest African American community. It had built many founding institutions, Mother Bethel Church, St. Thomas Church, the Free African Society. There was a lot going on, and it had a really stable but small black middle class. So, you know, the world you know is the world you know, and he was comfortable. Although he did spend quite a bit of time in Washington, D.C., because his father, as a minister, was associated with some churches in Washington, so he often went with his father on those visits, and he built a network of friends. In addition to that, a few of the students that came out of the Institute for Colored Youth ended up in D.C., helping to establish schools for the freed enslaved people, the people who had been formerly enslaved. And so they had invited Catto down to D.C. to help structure those schools. And he did a great job. And I will actually tell you, one of the schools that came out of this in D.C. is the M Street School, which later became Dunbar High School. And that was considered the top high school in the country, especially as you moved into the 20th century. So he left a strong legacy there in Washington, D.C., and had many friends. But I think he loved his friends in Philadelphia. That's the most I can say, because he didn't leave a diary to tell us why he wanted to stay. But, I mean, his connections here were obviously strong, including his beloved baseball team.
Yes, that's right. And he just did so much before the age of 32 when he died. It's really amazing. I want to talk about the Bill of Rights for equal access to public transit because in Philadelphia, where we are celebrating and having some events around Transit Equity Day, and there's going to be an event on Rosa Parks' birthday and also on Catto's birthday. And again, way before Rosa Parks and the civil rights movement was organizing around the buses. You had Octavius Catto here in Philadelphia doing something similar with the streetcars. Can you tell our listeners and viewers about some of that work?
Well, that work isn't Catto's alone. I think it's important because in telling that story, we often leave out the women, and I mentioned that to you. Yes, Catto sat a whole night on a trolley car, and it was an outrage. But black women were being thrown off of trolleys prior to Catto actually doing his sit-in at the trolleys. And one of the individuals who he had a very close relationship with, Carolyn LeCount, was his fiance, and she had some bad
And
experiences.
she was a teacher too.
She became a teacher and a principal, and she was a graduate of the Institute for Colored Youth. So just so you know, Catto was only the head of the boys division of the school. The principal, there were other people who were principals of the school that he worked for. So his role was somewhat narrow because, first of all, back then they tended to have men teach boys and women teach girls. There was a lot of separation of the races back then. But Catto's work was undergirded in the streetcar effort by the women who put their bodies on the line, and it was a sign of real disrespect of the women. First of all, if you wanted to take a trolley ride and you were black, you couldn't sit in the car like Rosa Parks. You had to be on the outside hanging on. And so imagine a woman with the long skirts and everything being put into it. And it was dangerous. You could fall off. And so he took a stand in support of what they were doing. And he also worked with political allies that he had, Thaddeus Stevens and William Kelly, who were both U.S. congressmen, to get the state legislature to pass the Bill of Rights for transportation. Catto had a strong hand in developing what the law would look like, but his experience sitting on that train all night made him realize that he wasn't going to get anywhere with the desegregation of public transportation by appealing to the owners of the trolley cars. So the only way they were going to get change was to have the state legislature actually pass a law.
And then even after that, they still didn't allow integration or people, and the women are the ones who tested that law.
The women, and particularly Carolyn LeCount, she tested that law, and she was actually thrown off a trolley. So she took the case to court. Can you imagine this?
And the judge didn't believe her.
She didn't believe her at first. It was like, you don't. Well, first of all, during that time, women really didn't have a voice or a public voice that people recognized. Even the women abolitionists had a real hard time having people accept them being outspoken. Women were supposed to be demure and in their homes or with their children, or maybe a school teacher. But, to be out there testing a law, that was like, no, that didn't happen, kind of thing. So, but she was a very willful, strong-headed person, secure in herself. She came from a black middle-class family. Her father was an undertaker. They were members of St. Thomas Church. And she grew up being confident in who she is. And so she wasn't taking any flack on that. So that's why I always say we've got to look to the stories of the women as well. This is not, Catto's story is as much about women as it is men. And I learned that lesson actually from the Catto family, because they, the descendants of Catto, helped us shape the education website that we built. And the oldest member of the family said to me, remember the women, because Catto's life was made possible by the women in our family as well. And so I'm like, oh God, I've got to take this to heart.
Yeah, I mean, I'm always skeptical of anybody who says they did anything alone, right? The best organizers work in coalitions.
Yep.
They get support from a diversity of people, and Catto was no exception. I do want to move on to talk about women involved in organizing the Black vote and the anniversaries of the 15th and the 19th Amendments, which, respectively is the 150th and 100th anniversary this year in 2020. Can you talk more about that and how Catto's involvement and the women's organizing as well, influenced this amendment to be passed and helped getting people to go out and vote?
Well, actually, that's a story that's not told very well. And I'm working with a group of people now to bring forward the story of the women who actually helped make the 15th Amendment possible. The Society of Cattos, as I had said, had very strict rules about the role of women and what they should be doing. But in the Black communities, those boundaries were always challenged. There were a series of what they called colored people's conventions during Catto's time that brought together the community to work on what kinds of legislative issues needed to be out there, what kind of social issues needed to be brought forward to address the condition of the African American. And some of the women who participated in that served as supports by providing ways for delegates to get together. So many of you may have heard of the Green Book movie. Yeah. And during Catto's time, there weren't many hotels available for delegates to stay in if they came together either in Philadelphia or Syracuse or Harrisburg. So the Black women made sure that there were spaces and homes for the Black men delegates to these conventions would be in. And they also used those as opportunities to express what they were concerned about. And some of the men, including Catto, especially through the Pennsylvania Equal Rights League, was willing to be an advocate for women's rights in terms of voting with the 15th Amendment. It didn't get very far, but there were other men who they weren't anti-woman, but what they were concerned was that it was going to be extremely hard to get a 15th Amendment for Black males that gave them rights because of the racism in the society and the way they saw Black people. The majority saw Black people as not being competent, and then to add these fragile women who seemed least educated. This is the mindset of people back then.
Sure.
This was going to make the process even more complicated. And it was because of that that some Black men said, first the men, then the women. And so in the Black community, the 15th Amendment was seen as unfinished business. In some of the white community, especially with people like Susan B. Anthony, it seemed like a betrayal because they actually had male in the legislation. People like Frances Harper, who's actually spent a lot of her life here in Philadelphia. She only lived almost a half block from the Institute for Colored Youth. She was an amazing orator herself and writer. And actually some people, in looking through all various archives, have found that she's probably the most prolific woman writer in the 19th century. She was an inspiration to Toni Morrison for her book, Beloved. So this is how amazing Frances Harper is. She continued to push forward with white suffragettes to try to have blacks be a part of the 19th Amendment. And now the 19th Amendment doesn't say black people are excluded, but the way they ended up being excluded was by practice. So by the time the 19th Amendment was passed, Jim Crow was very much embedded in the South. There were Jim Crow practices across the country. And the way our elections work, which is something people need to understand today, is that even though there can be a federal law that says you have the right to vote, the actual voting process is managed at the state and local level. And that's why today, even though there's supposed to be universal suffrage, there's voter suppression in places. So to me, this is still unfinished business because there's a lot of discrimination based on race and economics that keep people from voting. So we often present these stories as important high moments without digging deep into what they have really meant. For Catto, the 15th Amendment was a signature moment. And the fact that he had worked with others like Frederick Douglass and Henry Garnett in getting the legislation passed. And by the way, Garnett is pictured in a portrait at the Capitol showing the passage of the 19th Amendment. He was one of Catto's New York people. What it did do is that it laid the foundation. It laid the foundation for the modern civil rights movement, because without those federal laws on the books, it still would have been an uphill, even more of an uphill climb to get the voting rights legislation in 1965 and going forward. So it was foundational. But as I say, even today, as we celebrate the 19th Amendment, we really need to recognize that there are large swaths of women, particularly African American, Native American, Chinese American, who were not able to vote because of state and local laws in our nation.
Yeah, my family lives in Puerto Rico, and they cannot vote for president in the elections. And we see all the people that are incarcerated and people formerly incarcerated that also don't have voting rights. People in the county jails who haven't even been convicted of anything. And then, of course, the business in Florida with having to pay the fines, which is seen as a poll tax. So it goes on and on. It is, I agree, unfinished business, and we need to keep fighting, yes, and changing these laws and building off, the work of all of these amazing people.
And we also, I think, need to tell the stories to our children differently, because we get excited. The suffragettes won the right to vote. But the question is, who got to vote? And the 15th Amendment gave black males the right to vote, but were they able to? So we need to be able to tell those stories more clearly to our children so they understand the unfinished business that they have to do to make America what it needs to be, living up to the ideals we espoused at the founding.
Yes, and the sacrifices that were made. People literally putting their bodies on the line, suffering a lot of violence, abuse, intimidation, and even death. And Ida B. Wells was also a black suffragette, and she spent time in Philadelphia. And actually, Frances Harper she saw as one of her mentors, and everybody knows her from her campaign against lynching. And a lot of the lynching was done because black men and women were trying to exert their rights. And some of it was in voting. And so we need to remember those sacrifices. I actually tell my children, at this point, kids, you got some crazy ideas because you're young, okay? I don't care who you vote for, but you better vote because our people lived and died to have this right. Don't ever let anybody take that from you. So, we've got to get people out there voting. And one of my big pet peeves now is that it's very important to
re-empower African American males to vote, because they were really significant in the 19th century in the North, particularly. I was looking at a chart recently that showed how the 19th Amendment was passed, and if it wasn't for Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, we wouldn't have a 19th Amendment ratification in Pennsylvania. And the black population in Philadelphia was very significant in supporting that. So, I always tell people, we've got to gain our power back and do these things because they can make a difference.
And on this show, we say, don't just vote, organize.
Organize.
Right? Organize, educate yourself, and, get involved in the community. I think Catto exemplified all those things, and especially young people. Again, having people under the age of 30 civically engaged, organizing, sharing, that energy, that enthusiasm, I think only results in positive outcomes. I do want to talk about Catto's death and the day, the events surrounding his death, because, again, he gave his life for this right to vote. And so here in Philadelphia, he had been working with Republicans, actually, not Democrats, and organizing people, talking to people one by one, having community meetings, and encouraging people to overcome their fear and get out the vote. And some people voted, but it wasn't until after he died that, more people decided to go out there and vote because he had given his life. Can you talk about that day and some of the things that happened?
Okay. Well, actually, I want to start just a few days before.
Okay.
Because what is important to understand is that political parties can change over time. And during Catto's time, the Republican Party was the party of Lincoln. It was the party that had passed. Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which no matter what people say about it, the one thing that was clearly important about that was that it enabled African Americans to serve as federal troops. And I know you're going to have a person on your show afterwards who's a U.S. United States colored troop reenactor. And that was clearly a major turning point because the black community had fought very hard, lobbied very hard with Lincoln to do that. So from that moment on, they were Lincoln peeps. Okay, I'm just going to say that. But the party also advanced various civil rights efforts in the Congress. So to the African American community, the Republican Party was the party. And Catto became an ardent Republican. I mean, over-the-top Republican. He was actively involved with the Union League. He tried to lobby and convince people in the community how important it is for them to vote Republican. The problem is that the black community was in Philadelphia at that time was adjacent to the Irish community, which was largely Democratic. So the political tensions between the two communities was very high.
And the Irish immigrants, Irish community made up a lot of the police force as well.
Yeah, well, all politics is about power and opportunity. And when a party's in charge, their people come in. And so the Democrats are in, the Irish police are in. If the Republicans come in, what happened to the Irish police? I'm just saying that's the dynamic people are looking at, and their jobs were on the line from their perspective. There was a lot of things wrapped up into this, and so they were fighting over real stuff. The first election in 1870, which was the first election where blacks could vote in Philadelphia, there were actually federal troops on the ground. Under the Enforcement Act that helped to quell any of the dangers that were rising up in the communities. But in 1871, the election where Catto was assassinated, there were no federal troops on the ground. And he was very concerned that Irish gangs and other white gangs were going around intimidating people. And actually, a number of African American men were shot. Actually, one man was shot in front of his 4-year-old daughter and shot right in the head. Catto was not the only one to die.
Yeah, several people were shot at, and there was a lot of violence,
And
too.
there was a lot of violence. And by the way, Philadelphia has had a history of racial violence over its lifetime during the time of Catto. And so when Catto was shot, right before he was shot, he was actually going back to where he lived. He lived in a boarding house, which was very common for teachers at the time, to get some of his military equipment because he had been made a brigadier inspector in African American division as part of the Pennsylvania National Guard. So he was going to call his troops to replace the federal troops that weren't there. So it was his intent was not to create violence, but try to quell the violence. But as I had mentioned, Catto was really well known. Everybody knew him. The Irish people knew him. The black people knew him. I'm just saying everybody knew because he had such a strong reputation. And so Frank Kelly saw him and assassinated him. Now, because he was such a well-known figure and a much respected figure, he ended up having the largest funeral in Philadelphia after the funeral we had for Abraham Lincoln, which was huge. He had 125 carriages, all these officials. They actually closed the city government.
Yeah, they shut everything down. They paid for it.
Yeah.
And they gave him a military funeral,
He
too.
had because he was a military man. So, I often imagine him wearing his military uniform in his casket. I mean, I don't know for sure because I don't have a real description. I haven't been able to find a description of that. But it was a military funeral. And he was buried at Lebanon Cemetery, which was at that point down in Passyunk Avenue. And it was a cemetery founded by the family of a childhood friend of his, Jacob White Jr. So it was, a lot of outrage in the community broadly about him being killed and the way he was killed. However, there were other forces that helped Frank Kelly get away. It was nearly 10 years before the trial finally was held, and it ended up that he was acquitted, and it was an all-white jury, I will say. So, it makes you think about criminal justice. When we were doing the education project, in reading Catto's story, I became very concerned about how do we tell that story to young people today because of all the things that have happened with black men, don't shoot, hands up, the other things with police being culpable in situations that were against black people. So we worked really hard to help people, teachers, be able to have really good conversations with kids around the Catto story in terms of how they were feeling that story resonated with them. It was important for us to let teachers know that the students needed to express themselves, even if it wasn't totally historically accurate. You can always go back to the history and explain what really happened. But, there's this sense of, there was this sense among us planning it that we had to empower teachers to let students speak, which is something that you guys like to do, empower people to speak up. And then you figure out what the real facts are so people can come together if they can. So
That's right. That's why it's, the People Power show, because, all the great things were accomplished, through people power and people like Octavius Catto. Before we go to a break and start speaking with Earl, can we just talk about, his legacy, everything that he did and what it means for people today in this particular time?
Well, it's sometimes it's a challenge to figure out what people's legacies are unless you know their stories. I mean, I'm just saying it's really challenging. So part of what we did for the memorial project is that we actually talked, one, to the family to see what the legacy was to them, because family members can really shape who you become as adults. And I will tell you that the Catto family continues to live forward his legacy of education and accomplishment. So that's the first thing. And I think it's awesome. And I saw the little Catto children at the memorial, and they were just, living their power. So that's one thing. The other thing is that his story, I think, empowers young people today to look at their world in a more critical way and also own their own power. The fact that he developed himself to be a great scholar, he worked for his community. So part of the work that we did with the kids was to have them tell their story around Catto. How is it empowering him? What's the legacy they feel he left them? So people should think about that. But in terms of other things that are legacies, as I mentioned earlier, Catto laid the foundation for civil rights activism like Martin Luther King going forward. If he had not worked with others to get those laws on the books, they would have been starting from a different place. And that was, it could have been a problem. Also at the Institute of Colored Youth, even though he was not the principal of the school, he left a legacy there, and there were people who were his students who went on to do amazing things. One of them was John Cromwell, who ended up moving to D.C. He became one of Catto's D.C. people because he wrote in his memoir about how he was an awesome teacher for him. But he himself laid the foundation for Carter G. Woodson to do what he did in terms of Black history, gathering Black history, legacy around. So, you may not. It's sometimes challenging, but you got to look through the lives of others, how Catto is touching people today, how his legacy lives in his family, and also how he may, through what he has done, change the way our world is today. Because I believe that what he did with the voting rights was probably the most important thing he could have done to help make the modern civil rights movement move forward.
Absolutely. You can see his memorial. It's a beautiful, beautiful sculpture on the south side of City Hall, facing a Broad Street. I encourage everyone who's here in Philadelphia to definitely stop by, give homage,
And I would also say, and this is what I did on my birthday, is to go hold his hands and just say thank you.
Yes. And get inspired by him.
Yeah.
That's a source of inspiration if you're interested in. V. Chapman-Smith, it's been a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you for sharing your knowledge. Is there a website or a resource you'd like to share with the public if they would like more information?
Well, I would recommend that people go to the public website that we put up for the school children, and it's catto.ushistory.org. And we call the website Forging Citizenship, which is what I feel Catto did for us. He helped to forge citizenship. And not just for African Americans, because the laws that he got on the books ended up supporting Native Americans, Latinos, Chinese today. I mean, it has made a big difference, and eventually it had an impact on the way the 19th Amendment came about. So definitely check that website out and learn what the kids learned.
All right. Thank you so much. Remember, Black History is not just in February. It's 365 days a year. When we come back to the People Power Lunch Hour show, we'll speak with a Civil War reenactor, Earl Weeks, who's also a Philly Cam member and producer. He'll talk about some of his reenactment work and also how Catto organized Black men in this area to serve in the Army and in the Civil War. Thanks so much for watching and listening. We'll be right back.
We are members of the 3rd Regiment Infantry, United States Colored Troops, Civil War reenactors. We are a nonprofit charitable organization here to educate the masses in the history and service of the blacks that fought during the Civil War.
I like Civil War reenacting because it gives us the opportunity to tell the stories of our ancestors, stories that are forgotten, stories of bravery, stories of courage, stories of commitment. And that's why I like it, so that we can finally tell the truth about who we are. Well, I know you're wondering, just why should we come out? Why should we spend our time to come out and hear these stories of 150 years ago or more? Well, the reason that you should come out and hear these stories is because they are our stories. Our great-grandparents were the ones who had served, were the ones who had escaped from slavery to create the contraband camps in Cincinnati and Washington, D.C., in New Orleans, Louisiana, and Nicholasville, Kentucky. They were our ancestors. So we need to come out to remember what they did and how they did it.
Hello and welcome back to the People Power Lunch Hour Show. I'm your host, Vanessa Maria Graber. This month, it's February, it's Black History Month, and we wanted to talk about the life and work of Octavius Catto. In the first half hour, we talked with historian V. Chapman-Smith about the legacy that Octavius Catto left behind with his activism and his work. One of the things that he also was very involved in was assembling some of the first regiments of black soldiers to serve in the Civil War, and he did that here in Philadelphia. In the studio, I have Earl Weeks. He's a Civil War reenactor. He's also a producer here at Philly Cam, so he works with us creating TV projects, and he's going to talk about his work as a Civil War reenactor and again, the work of Octavius Catto in organizing black troops and that legacy that he left behind in that regard. Welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you.
Can you talk about their Civil War reenactments and, what it meant at that time to have black soldiers serving in the war? As V. Chapman mentioned that at first when they tried to bring troops to Gettysburg, there was an emergency call for more troops, and Octavius Catto said, let's start getting some black soldiers on the line. They didn't want them to serve initially, but then later on they were able to serve in the war, and they did a lot of that training and recruitment here in Philadelphia. Can you give a short history about what happened during that time?
Okay, so Octavius Catto, a bunch of students and other people from the school that he was with, they went to Gettysburg to fight, but they took their weapons from them because they were black. They didn't want them to have weapons. They didn't want them to shoot other people. So they took their weapons from them and sent them home. But that was, in 1863, Abraham Lincoln came out with the Emancipation Proclamation. So the Emancipation Proclamation actually, it said that slaves were free, but only in the southern states, those states that were in rebellion. Since Lincoln was not in charge of those states, it really carried no weight. But he also used the Emancipation Proclamation to allow black men to be able to fight. And then what happened once he made that in July, they start making boot camps, Camp William Penn was the one that was made here outside Philadelphia, in what we call today Cheltenham, in the Lamont section. And it's called the Lamont section because Lucretia Mott used to live there, and her family. And what they did was they rented the area to the government for $1 for the duration of the war to be used for colored troops there. So when Octavius Catto was recruiting, he recruited men to come to Camp William Penn. There ended up being 11 regiments of black men that graduated from there. The first was the 3rd United States Colored Troops. That's the unit that we represent here in Philadelphia as Civil War reenactors. But there also were the 6th, the 8th, the 22nd, the 24th, the 32nd, the 41st, the 43rd, the 45th, and the 127th. And they were all called the United States Colored Troops. That was the designation that was given to them. And, sometimes when we say it today, people look at it as funny, but that's the term they used back then. So we carry it too. A lot of people know about the 54th Massachusetts. They were also considered colored troops. They just don't use the name determination. Also, there was actually a regiment from the 54th that were recruited, and they were from Philadelphia.
Earl, how did you get involved in being a Civil War reenactor?
Oh, my goodness, that's a crazy story. I was actually one of my friends. We're in disabled veterans group and stuff, and he was one of the founders. And I seen him walk around in uniform. I never paid any attention. But I was taking this class at Community College of Philadelphia, corporate video. I decided I wanted to do a documentary on him. So I go to this meeting, and I'm like, I am not joining. I will not join this unit. So they're talking to me, and I'm talking to them, and they're telling me their stories. The next thing I know, I take out my wallet, pay $10. And, even to today, 16 years later, I'm still saying I'm not joining.
And so talk about some of the work that you do as reenactors. Where do you do the reenactments? And what's the history that you'd like to convey to people when you do the reenactments?
Okay, so we do not only reenactments, because everybody, when they see us, stressed. Is there a reenactment? Oh, my goodness, we can't stand that, because everything is not a reenactment.
Okay.
But we go to churches, we go to schools, we're in parades. We do all kinds of things just to support and sponsor, to educate, because a lot of people, myself, I never thought about black men fighting in the Civil War until, as a grown-up, and this would be nice if our children know this as they grow up instead of learn it later in life.
In a way, it's an extension of your media work, because you're telling a story through this work, right? You're storytellers.
Exactly.
Can you tell us a little bit about the uniform, since you came dressed? Because, again, they tell a story, right?
Yes,
the bag,
yes.
everything.
For sure. First of all, we'll start with the hat. They actually have a couple different ways, but originally these hats were left from the Battle of the War of 1812. So what they did was they redesigned it, they colored it, and they took the stays out. They used to stand up. When you're on march, they also use it to gather food and stuff like that. Our uniforms is all made of wool. The reason is, during the war, the Civil War, the South had all the cotton. So the North could do nothing but make everything out of wool. This is not a summer. They don't have a summer uniform. This is it. If it's 100-something degrees, you're supposed to have this on. It's just the boots are weird because they're actually built neutral. There's no left or right. You could put them on either foot. That way, if you had a hole in your shoe, if you couldn't buy any new ones, you could just go take one off a body that was there and use it. And you just one. You didn't have to take both.
Yeah, they're kind of like rectangular shaped.
Yes. And actually, they're called brogans. And I know all the older people, especially old men, just went, oh, wow. Because in the old days, your dad used to always say, man, I'm going to get you some brogans because they'll last forever. and that's what they are. And then, like, the jacket I have on, this is the fatigue uniform, more for fighting or work. They also have a field uniform they call it the frock, which would have, like, shoulder brackets and everything on it.
How were the black soldiers treated? Were they respected, especially by other people in the black community? Like, what happened to them during and after the war?
Okay, in the black community, I would say they were respected. There's always going to be a little bit of looking down at them because you look at people, just almost like the military today. You look at people sometimes as being used themselves, you know. But they did a lot, and they were able to do some things, like talking about that. You ever heard of Juneteenth?
Yes.
Okay. So the Civil War was from 1861 to 1865. Blacks were in the Civil War from 63 to 65. Well, after the war was over, there was some blacks who still had time. So what they did was they had them go to Texas. And then 1866, they went to Texas, and there still were people being enslaved. So when they got there, something about the 54th, too, if you saw Glory, you saw where they had a thing about not getting paid correctly. Mm-hmm. So by that time, they caught up with the pay. And these soldiers had so much pay. So when they told the slaves that they were free, they ended up having a jubilee and, like a big, huge party. So the slaves bought food and things from the plantations. The soldiers took and paid for other things. So that's what we celebrate today as Juneteenth.
What impact did the addition of these 11 regiments have on the Civil War?
A lot, a lot of times we say it made the difference. One of the differences when I talked about the Emancipation Proclamation before was that the secret of the slaves being freed from the South is that they were helping the Confederates, digging, horses, cooking, all kinds of stuff. So what happened was as the North came, the soldiers made it to South. The slaves escaped, and then they became soldiers themselves. So that helped weaken the South. That was one of the biggest weapons.
And can you talk about what went on at Camp William Penn and its historical significance?
Yes. Camp William Penn, they, of course, they had a lot of different training. Frederick Douglass actually came there and talked to the troops. Harriet Tubman came and talked to the troops. A lot of people actually died before they left Camp William Penn because they didn't know what we know about germs. The doctors would wash their hand in the basin and then put their hand inside somebody and touch someone with fever and wash their hand in the same basin. They knew nothing about germs, so a lot of people died there. But it trained the troops to be able to fight, and they gained a lot of medals of honor and stuff. Actually, one of the guys in our regiment is related to Sergeant Carney. He was in the 54th Massachusetts. He's the first black soldier to win the Medal of Honor for his gallantry at Fort Wagner in South Carolina. That was in the movie Glory. He is the one who carried the flag. And then the 6 United States colored troops from New Jersey, they also trained at Camp William Penn. They won many medals of honor and battles in Virginia especially. Yeah.
So when's your next project or appearance? How can people in Philly interact with, the reenactors or, the storytellers that you're involved with?
Okay, so there's a couple things. One, on the 12th is Lincoln's birthday, and we'll be at the Union League at 12 o'clock. We'll be outside doing a salute to Lincoln, and then later on there'll be a parade. On February 22nd, we'll be celebrating Octavius Catto's, they say Catto and Catto, depending on who you talk to. We'll be celebrating his birthday at City Hall. I think it's at 2 o'clock. Also, I actually wrote a play called 54321 Beat 'em All. It's about a battle rapper and a slave, and it'll be showed here at Philly Cam on February 15th. But the tickets are sold out, so you have to wait till it comes on Philly Cam.
Only if you're staffed. So you can check it out. But hopefully we could see, the video on the channel and all of that. Earl, you do amazing work, and you have so much pride in sharing this history, and I think it's so important. I want to thank you for coming to share the story. How can people get in touch with you or get more information about all of this?
Okay, so the easiest thing would probably to go on Facebook, 3RD USCT, our 3rd United States Colored Troops, on Facebook, and the same thing on Instagram.
All right, and you can catch them February 15th at the Union League.
February 12th.
February 12th, and on February 29th.
22nd.
22nd. See, I'm getting all these dates wrong.
It's our busiest month.
This February. You can catch them at the Union League and also at City Hall. Earl Weeks, thank you so much for joining the show.
You're welcome.
All right, that's going to do it for this edition of the People Power Lunch Hour Show. We're going to continue Black History Month with our next episode. We're going to be talking about the movement here in Philadelphia and its legacy. And again, if you'd like to catch this episode or any of our episodes of the People Power Lunch Hour Show, you can go to our website, phillycam.org, and check out our video on demand. You could also visit our YouTube page, PhillyCam, and we have a People Power